Shoes are fantastic objects. They're really how we identify ourselves. They say the shoes make the outfit. They're really how you express your personal style. And they're not something that you can easily tell how they were made. My name is Sarah Guerin, and I'm a bootmaker. I grew up in Lynn in Swampscott, Massachusetts, and today I'm at the Lynn Museum, where I often talk about shoemaking and bootmaking and the history of footwear making in Lynn, which was globally significant, and how that relates to my practice today, where I work in my workshop in Wakefield, Mass. The shoemaking history in Lynn was so important, and it was so significant on a worldwide scale. And having grown up here, I didn't really understand or know, because that connection has been completely severed. That knowledge got lost as well. Those early shoemakers in Lynn knew how a shoe was made from beginning to end. And an example of that is the Vamp Building. It's this really large, beautiful building right across the street from the Lynn Museum. That's a brick building. It was the largest shoe factory at one time. And if you look at it from the sky, it's in this odd triangular shape, but that was a vamp pattern. So every single woman in all of Lynn would have known what that was, because she cut that out of leather and she sewed that together into the upper of a shoe. And no one really knows why the Vamp Building is called the Vamp Building anymore, because we've had such a complete disconnect from how shoes are made that that word is gone from our vocabulary today. I always wanted to be a shoemaker, but I didn't really understand that that was something that one could be. I would sew pieces of fabric together trying to make shoes, and was sort of figuring out on my own how things went together, but had no guidance and no example of shoemakers out there. And if you think about it, all our shoes today are mostly plastic. Maybe dress shoes have a leather top, but the soles are still going to be rubber, and they're very complex objects. So it's not something that you can look at and easily understand how they're made. But I was very interested in that from an early age. I went to art school in Rhode Island, and every project that I had, I would make shoes. So if they assigned something out of cardboard, I'd be making cardboard shoes. So I definitely was drawn to work with my hands and drawn to shoes in some way. I found a shoemaking school in England. So I went to this school in England and I learned how shoes were made, but it was how shoes were made in factories. I did not want to make shoes that fall apart. I wanted to make significant, beautiful objects that are built to last and built to be repaired. When I left the school, one of the professors had said, what you really need is somebody who knows how to make shoes. They're called Bespoke Makers. The only person in Massachusetts doing that at that time, in the early to mid 2000s, was a cowboy bootmaker who had married a woman from Massachusetts and moved here from Colorado. I met him and I persisted in asking him over and over if he would teach me what he knew, and he finally did. So I apprenticed with him for 3 years. He taught me everything that I know about building boots by hand from raw materials, from scratch. The process is exactly the same as those early 1800s shoemakers, which is different from how shoes are made today, although generally the overview of those processes are still the same. You still need a last to make a sneaker, you still need a pattern cutter, a pattern designer that then cuts the pattern pieces out of leather or fabric or whatever. Your sneakers probably, if you look at them, have 20 different pattern pieces on top, and you don't really think about all the work that goes into that. When I first started using the Lynn Museum's archives as a significant part of my bootmaking practice, it was to look up the stories of shoemakers and the conditions of their lives in these 1800s, in the old-fashioned times, because I am a mother and I have 3 kids and I was at home with them, and I'm a bootmaker working in my basement, and I really wanted to have that fluidity to my life, to be able to go out into the yard and work when I could work, having my kids around me, and I had to be fluid and flexible in the way that I work. And I started understanding that this is a human problem. This is part of the legacy of shoemaking in Lynn. These women were working on shoes in their homes, but they had their children there. A 10-footer is a small shoemaking factory. And when I say factory, it's because they produce a lot of shoes in there, but it's a small building that looks like a shed. They are easily identifiable to anybody who knows what they are because they're a small building with a chimney, and that was because they had these little potbelly coal stoves where they warmed the wax for shoemaking. They kept the little tools for finishing the bottom of shoes, and they kept water because there's a lot of water involved in working with leather, and kept it from freezing in the winter. So these little buildings had enormous windows, so that looks a little bit odd too, and that's because we used daylight in those times to work. So it was really hard to sew shoes by candlelight, which they did in the winter, but you had a prime spot if you were a shoemaker that was next to one of these windows. And these little buildings were everywhere. I found one record from 1899, which is 50 years after these little 10-footers were being used, of how many were left in Lynn, and there were 60 of them then. So there were hundreds of them in 1830 and 40 at their heyday. And Lynn was sort of the center of where this type of manufacturing in these little 10-footers happened, but it spread out all over greater Boston. So there were 10-footers all the way up in southern New Hampshire. So the 10-footers were in people's backyards or side yards. They might have been on the street, and they were really accessible. They were only one step up, so it was easy to walk down the street and pop your head in the door or the window. And that too, I think, helped preserve the craft. Even if you didn't work in the shoe industry, you knew how shoes were made. And they might be associated just to your family. So it might be your building, and the husband and father or grandfather and uncles worked together while the women in the house were making uppers by hand, but it quickly grew so large. We really had this robust system of shoe production in 10-footers that was no longer the case by the end. Somebody owned the building that might not be a shoemaker in there, and we have records of this in the Lynn Museum. The 10-footers became obsolete because the processes got mechanized and the machines are big. There were new developments in architecture that allowed larger buildings, which allowed more of these big machines to be packed in together, and the scale of production just grew exponentially, and there was no reason to have a 10-footer anymore. It wasn't economically viable. In my 10-footer, I do all of the processes from beginning to end inside the building. So I have my sewing machines in there, which would not have happened in old-fashioned times, but I have all the knowledge it takes to go from the very beginning, inception of the shoe idea and the design, to the end inside that space. $66 million pair of shoes are made every single day, day in and day out, that are made with materials that don't biodegrade. They get thrown into landfills because they're not made to last, they're not made to be repaired. And making a cowboy boot by hand is not the answer to that because they're really expensive. But there's something, I'm always searching through my practice to find that something that is the key to how we start going back toward that sustainable responsibility in our footwear, because it existed. It existed here in Lynn in a system where people made shoes built with a construction type that could be repaired over and over on a huge scale, because we ship those shoes all over the world from Lynn. So part of the importance of the history of Lynn shoemaking is invisible. It's in our library, it's in the archives, it's not something that we have in our daily lives every day because we've moved so far away from shoemaking. But I think it's important. It's important to understand our history. It's important to understand how that relates to shoemaking and bootmaking today. I'm somebody that's trying to keep this craft alive and doing it every day in my 10-footer deliberately to cross those gender divides in the history of our footwear making. And I'm trying to get as many stories as I can from people that worked in shoe factories to understand what it was like, to hear what it was like to work on your machine or in that room, and how the company worked. So if anybody has any stories of working in shoemaking, and even if it wasn't you, if it was your aunt or your grandfather, please contact me, and I would love to record your stories and put it into a larger context that is part of all of our history here.
To support Greater Lynn Senior Services and see more videos like these, please consider making a donation at the link below and subscribe to our channel.